Good afternoon and welcome to another one of our Roosevelt Facebook Live presentations. I'm Jeff Urbin, the Education Director here at the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. On behalf of our Library Director, Paul Sparrow, and the entire staff here at the Roosevelt Presidential Library, I want to welcome you to another one of our sessions. Today we are talking about Roosevelt and elections. Yes, we have a national election coming up this year, among everything else we've got going on. And we thought it would be kind of fun to take a look at how FDR's 4 national elections took place. Now, it's important to remember, Franklin Roosevelt is the only person in American history ever to be elected 4 times. And he's the only person in American history who will ever be elected 4 times. So let's start off talking just a little bit about that. Now, Franklin Roosevelt served as president for 12 years. Had he lived his entire 4th term, he would have been president for 16 years. And he died just 82 days into his 4th term. Now, the Constitution, as originally written, does not have term limits for the presidency. Right? The term limits were, in effect, the elections. So if you didn't like the president, you unelected him. George Washington, the nation's first president, set the political tradition or the precedent of serving for only 2 terms. He believed that we didn't need another King George. And he said after 2 terms is enough for anybody. Now it's time for some new blood to get in here. And that was the political tradition that was followed from 1800 all the way on up to 1932 with Franklin Roosevelt, or really actually 1940 with Franklin Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt had tried to run for a 3rd term, but only got 23% of the vote with the Bull Moose Party. And in 1953, the 22nd Amendment became part of the Constitution. And this was pushed through in large measure by the Republicans after the end of Roosevelt's 4 national elections, because they thought he'd been president for too long. They wanted to put a cap on this. And so they put forth the 22nd Amendment. It was passed in 1951, became part of the Constitution in 1953. And that now limits the president to 2 full terms and 2 years of somebody else's term. So the most you could be president now would be 10 years. So if you pick up 2 years of somebody else's term, then you are entitled to 2 full terms of your own. And this was kind of backfired, because by that time Eisenhower was in office, and they would love to have had Eisenhower for a 3rd term, had he been up to it, medically and such. So this now assures that Roosevelt will be in this unique position to be the only one ever elected to the presidency 4 times. Interestingly enough, if we contrast that to Gerald Ford, he's the only president who was never elected at all, right? He was appointed vice president after Spiro Agnew resigned the vice presidency and then ascended to the presidency when Nixon resigned. So sometimes, sometimes if I get very busy, I wish I worked at the Ford Museum. He was only president for 2 years, and a presentation on Ford's national election would take just a few minutes because there was only one. And it didn't really work out for him the way he had hoped that it would. But Roosevelt did win 4 national elections. So let's take a look at these. The first year Roosevelt was elected was 1932. His opponent was, of course, the sitting president, Herbert Hoover. The main issue that year was the economic crisis, the Great Depression that was going on in the country at that time. The electoral vote was 59 for Hoover, 472 for Roosevelt. Right? So big landslide there. In terms of the popular vote, that was about 16 million for Hoover and about 23 million for Roosevelt. So that was the 32 election. 1936, FDR is running for re-election against Alf Landon. And the main issue that year was a referendum basically on the New Deal. Does Roosevelt deserve a 2nd term? And people really believed that he did, because the electoral vote was 523 to 8 for Alf Landon. So just think about that, right? He only beat you and I by 8 electoral votes. The popular vote for that election was about 28 million for Roosevelt and only about 17 million for Alf Landon. The 1940 election was FDR versus Wendell Willkie. And the big issues in that election, 1940, were, number one, should there be a third term for Franklin Roosevelt, right? Because the political tradition says 2 terms and that's it. And the other thing was the threat of the looming war in Europe. Were we going to get into that war? Was that war going to come to us? And in terms of electoral votes, 449 for FDR, 82 for Wendell Willkie. That translates to about 27 million votes for Franklin Roosevelt and about 22 million votes for our pal Wendell Willkie. Then comes 1944, and FDR is now running for a 4th term. The issue that year was, should he stay in office to finish the war, right? This idea of not changing horses in midstream. And also, how was the post-war peace going to be crafted? And FDR's opponent that year was none other than Thomas Dewey. Now, Thomas Dewey was famous for getting his butt handed to him, basically by Harry Truman in the 1948 campaign that everybody thought, Truman was going to lose, but he didn't. And the famous newspaper of, Dewey defeats Truman. But he was first beaten by Franklin Roosevelt here in New York State in 1944. And that was one of the few times, and I think the last election when President Trump and Hillary Clinton were running against each other, they were technically from the same state. This time, you had Thomas Dewey and Franklin Roosevelt, who were actually from the same county, right here in Dutchess County. So had that election gone differently, there probably would have been 2 presidential libraries here in Dutchess County, one for FDR and one for Thomas Dewey, which would be good for job prospects. If things don't work out from here, they could have always gone over to the other side of the county out near polling. But it wasn't to be, because Thomas Dewey lost that election. And it was, again, a pretty good landslide, 432 electoral votes for President Roosevelt, 99, didn't break 100, for Thomas Dewey. But the popular vote was a little bit closer, to about 26 million to 22 million for Thomas Dewey. So those are the 4 elections that Roosevelt ran. And what I'd like to do is to describe a little bit about what each of those elections was about and how things were going on at the time. Now, in 1932, the global depression was underway, right? It wasn't just an American depression. It was a world global economic depression. Unemployment, 25%, as high as 60% in some cases. Suicide rate had tripled because people had lost hope. They had, basically begun to give up. The American economy had shrunken by about half. From 1929 to 1932, 9,000 banks closed, 100,000 businesses failed, corporate profits had dropped 90%, and farm profits had dropped 50%. In 1929, U.S. Steel had 100,000 full-time employees. By 1932, it had none. So this was the backdrop of the 1932 election. Now, poor old Herbert Hoover got the blame for this. He bore the brunt for all of this. Now, as we've talked about in some of the other Facebook Live sessions, there were a lot of converging factors that came about to bring about the Great Depression. Many of them, if not all of them, were completely out of Hoover's control, but he happened to be the responsible officer at the time. He was the guy in charge, and his efforts to bring an end to the Great Depression were perceived as being insensitive, as being incompetent, and as being too little, too late, and simply too unengaged. And that's not necessarily all true, but that was certainly the perception that was going on at the time. Speaking of perceptions, popular culture says any Democrat who had run against Hoover in 1932 would have won the presidency. And that is probably true, but I want to take a little bit of an issue with that, because that takes away from the fact that Franklin Roosevelt had actually been working very, very hard on becoming president prior to the election. Certainly people were tired of Hoover. When you look at those statistics I just listed, this is not the record you want to be running on. But Franklin Roosevelt had carefully cultivated for almost 4 years how he was going to come to power and be the Democratic nominee in 1932. The Democratic Party from 1928 to 1932 was fractured. It had begun to split. Some demographic changes had occurred in the country, and there were about 6.2 million people who left the farms throughout the 1920s into the 1930s, who then became new voters in cities. People began to forget what the Republicans had done for them. You know, the Republican Party was sort of the party of Lincoln, you know, and a lot of the Southern folks who had, you know, benefited from, you know, Lincoln's policies and such had begun to forget what the Republicans had done for them. The Republican Party of 1932 was far different than the Republican Party of 1860. And so there was also a big split that year about Prohibition. The folks in the North and the cities tended to want to end Prohibition, whereas the folks in the South and the West tended to want to keep Prohibition under control. So Roosevelt took a look at all these demographic factors, all these cultural factors, and all these political factors, and he began to cultivate relationships with inner city bosses, the Democratic bosses in the North and the larger cities up around the North. And he also began to cultivate relationships with Democrats at the county level in the South and in the West. So he was really a bridge candidate between, you know, people like Al Smith, who was the 1928 candidate and wanted to be again in 32, and people like John Garner of Texas. So Smith represented the Northeast, Garner represented the South and the West, and that was where the friction and the division occurred. Who was it that once said, I belong to no organized political party. I am a Democrat. I believe that was Will Rogers. And that pretty much summed up the way things were leading up to the 1932 election. But Roosevelt had worked very hard to cultivate those relationships. And so he was in a good position politically in order to win the presidency. By the spring of 32, Roosevelt is, of course, the governor of New York. And he is now the front runner for the Democratic nomination in 32. He's quite popular. He's quite famous in part because of his cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, who was his mentor and whose career Roosevelt crafted his own career upon. New York State was at the time the most populous state, and Roosevelt had had a string of successes in New York State leading up to the 1932 election. One of the things that was quite interesting about President Roosevelt was he had two dress rehearsals for the presidency. The first was that he was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War, which becomes very important when he finds himself as Commander-in-Chief during the Second World War. And the second dress rehearsal was that he was the governor of New York, the largest state in the Union at the time, during the first 4 years of the Great Depression. What that means is that many of the New Deal programs were actually tried out as small experiments here in New York State first, and then ratcheted up to the federal level when he became president. What he didn't have, Roosevelt, was majority support. Some people thought he was being opportunistic, you know, that he's just taking advantage of the situation as it was. Some people thought he was a lightweight. In fact, his own cousin, Alice Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's daughter, often referred to him as Feather Duster as a nickname because he thought she thought he was so much fluff and so you know, lightweight. And some people thought that Roosevelt was simply too rich and too New Yorky. Now, can you imagine anybody thinking somebody's too New Yorky? Come on, forget about it, right? But the emphasis that Roosevelt had was on action and movement and being dynamic. Hoover ran a typically bland campaign. Now, a minute ago, remember I said that Hoover, his attempts to resolve the Great Depression seemed as if he was being insensitive, seemed as if he was unengaged, seemed as if he was incompetent. These are all things that were not true, but that was the perception. And it was the perception in large part because Hoover's idea about how government works is that the federal government should do as little as possible. Let the market mechanisms work their way through, right? Let the communities, the states, the localities, they're the ones that are supposed to be doing these things, not the federal government. So in large measure, it was more of an ideological problem with Hoover than it was, personal attributes and those things as well. So at the Democratic convention, things began to take shape. Now, back in those days, primaries and caucuses were mostly window dressing, and the real decisions were made at the state capitals in smoke-filled rooms with the various political leaders deciding who was going to be advanced, who wasn't going to be advanced, and that's the way these things played out. So when they got to Chicago in the summer of 32, the two heavy hitters were Al Smith of New York and, of course, John Garner of Texas. And neither of them had the 2/3 majority to win the nomination, and neither did Franklin Roosevelt. So Roosevelt began to work some of these connections that he had made through these county level Democrats and the city level Democrats that he'd been cultivating over the last 4 years. And he was able to garner no pun intended, he was able to garner a deal, broker a deal with James Garner. And he offered Garner the number 2 spot on the ticket if Garner would throw his support to Roosevelt. And in fact, that's what he did. And they won the nomination on the 4th ballot. Now, in his acceptance speech, Roosevelt famously said, "I pledge you, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people." When Roosevelt said that, and it appeared on page 18 of his speech, it was the second to last paragraph, by the way. It was in large member, just a soundbite, really. It was just a phrase, but the press, the media picked it up, and they used that as the soundbite. And so that's how the term "the New Deal" came about. He says, "I pledge you, I pledge myself to a new deal," and the press picked that up, and what they basically did was made that the title and the name for Roosevelt's set of programs, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. Now, Roosevelt had a bag of ideas. He had some ideas of how things would work, things that he had tried first here in the state of New York while governor. But to say that there was this big master plan of the New Deal, it really didn't exist. It was a loose set of ideas that were kind of floating around as sort of this nebulous bag of tricks that Roosevelt could use to try to bring about a betterment of the economy. All of the Roosevelt programs that we now know as the New Deal, were held together by 3 things. And we like to call those the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief. How do we bring about immediate relief to people who are suffering, people who are hungry, people who don't have clothing, people who don't have a place to live? Recovery. How do we get the people back in their jobs, farmers back on the farms, bankers back in the banks, teachers back in the schools, people back on their homes, factory workers back in the factories. And then, of course, this idea of reform. How do we prevent this from happening again? That was really the DNA of Roosevelt's New Deal. So if you want to think of any kind of real structure that there was to the New Deal, it was the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. So Roosevelt gets the nomination, and he shocks the nation and the convention by breaking political tradition and going to the convention to accept the nomination. But wait, there's more. He also does this by flying to the convention, which generated a lot of enthusiasm. It was electrifying. Here's this guy, he's literally flying in from the Northeast to accept the nomination and to lay out his plans for how he wants to become president. Compare that to President Hoover, who you can see over my shoulder over here. There he is over there, right? And you get a sense of the compare and contrast between the 2 campaigns. Hoover adopted a generally Hoover-esque approach to the campaign, very bland, very low-key. He didn't really feel like you should be auditioning to be president. He didn't really feel like you should be out there, begging for votes. He kind of felt that was beneath him. But of course, Roosevelt was the showman, right? Roosevelt loved to campaign. And in fact, Garner said to Roosevelt, All you need to do to win this election is stay alive until election day. But Roosevelt went out and he had a very vigorous campaign. He campaigned in 41 states, making hundreds of whistle-stop campaigns, being big on energy, big on electricity, big on creating, this sense of power and movement, but very, very sparse on details about how he was going to do these things. I'll give you one example. During the campaign, Prohibition, what to do about Prohibition was one of the big questions. So people would ask you, are you wet when it comes to Prohibition? Do you want to end Prohibition and allow there to be alcohol sales again, or are you dry? Do you want to stick with Prohibition? Well, to sort of split the difference, Roosevelt declared himself as damp. That way, he didn't alienate either side. I'll be damp. We'll figure it out when I get into office, and we'll work out the details then. So on November 8th, 1932, Roosevelt wins in a landslide, and the House and the Senate go to the Democrats as well. Roosevelt had basically been given a blank check. So people say, well, he comes into office and, he gets this first 100 days and all this, legislation gets passed, 15 or 16 pieces of major legislation in the first 100 days. How is he able to do that? Well, he's able to do that because there's a pretty big Democratic sweep, actually a huge Democratic sweep, into the White House, into the House of Representatives, and also into the Senate. And Roosevelt said, unless I miss the mark, people are asking for action and action now. And in fact, that's what they were looking for. And that's why he was able to accomplish so much. By 1933, he takes office on March 4th, 1933. He begins that first 100 days, and things begin to develop from there. By 1936, on the eve of his bid for re-election, unemployment had dropped from about 25% to anywhere from 8 to 14%. It was bouncing back and forth there. So clearly, some major gains in what people had come to expect in terms of the economy getting better. And so by 1936, let's change our magic election year poll. By 1936, the major issue of the election really is a referendum on the New Deal. Now, let me just say, let me just show you something here. We created this periodic table of the New Deal because when you tell people, about the New Deal, or you ask them, can you name some New Deal programs? Most people will say things like, well, there was the CCC and WPA and QVC and ESPN. Those last two, of course, weren't really programs. But there were over 44 programs that came to be part of the New Deal. So Roosevelt really was getting things done. What's holding this all together? The 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And that becomes the referendum that people are voting on in the 1936 election. Now, poor Alf Landon, right? He comes in and he's running for the Republicans, and basically people are still fed up with the Republicans at that point, right? They're still in the throes of the Great Depression. Things have gotten better, but they have not gotten completely better, and there's a lot of folks still blaming the Republicans for the economic downturn. So in 1936, Roosevelt wins in a landslide. And when he wins in this landslide, it gives him a false sense of political power, let's say, or maybe a false sense of security, because he gets more seats in the House, he gets more seats in the Senate, and now he's a second-term president with an even bigger majority in the Congress, and he begins to reach for some things that really were a little bit maybe of a political overreach. And three of the things that he decided to do kind of came back to sort of bite him later on. One was he tried to purge the Democratic Party. So there were some folks who were not going his way with some of these New Deal programs, and in the midterm elections, he had backed folks against these people, and I think it was all but one of them lost. And so this idea of purging the party of the non-New Dealers, came out of this idea that he had such political support from coming out of the 36 election. There was also the idea of the court packing, or as we like to call it, the Judicial Reorganization Act. And what this is that Roosevelt, saw that some of the programs of the New Deal were being challenged in the courts. Things like the National Recovery Administration, things like the Agricultural Adjustment Act had actually been turned over in the Supreme Court. And Roosevelt was afraid that if something wasn't done, many of these New Deal programs would be overturned. And so he decided that he was going to help out the court by promoting 6 more justices onto the Supreme Court, so raising the number from 9 up to 16. And the idea of this, of course, was he would be able to pick the folks who got to be on the court, and of course he would pick folks that were, judicially leaning in favor of the New Deal. It was really pretty much a raw political power grab. It didn't go through. People say, well, he shouldn't have been able to do it. He was perfectly within his rights to do it, because if you read the Constitution, Article 3 says that there shall be a Supreme Court and other inferior courts, as from time to time the Congress shall ordain. So the president was fine in asking Congress to raise the number of Supreme Court justices, but the Congress was right in not allowing that to happen. And through a crazy turn of events, the whole thing kind of fell to the wayside. But what it did was it helped to unite people against Roosevelt. So people who had been against him for different reasons began to come together and saying, well, maybe this guy really does, need to be more clearly looked at, and maybe more, closely watched and more closely checked in terms of his political power. Another problem that occurred after that election was that Roosevelt, the economy had been going better from 25 down to 14 to 8%, and he kind of pulled back the gas on that, and that led to the Roosevelt recession. So unemployment began to go back up again, and what it's indicated was that the economy wasn't as strong, really, as it seemed to be, without this federal money being pumped in there along the way as well. So he gets through the second term. And by the end of the second term, 1939, 1940, there are 2 things on his mind, 2 main problems that he's concerned about. Number 1 is his New Deal legacy. He believes if there is not a strong Democrat to follow him in office, his New Deal programs, his New Deal legacy will be dismantled, and all of his hard work will have been for nothing. And he didn't see any decent Democrats coming up along the way. Now, he had been kind of pruning some folks to maybe take over after his, take over from him, after he left office. But come to find out, he was finding out that these guys weren't really up to snuff according to his criteria. So one thing he's worried about is his New Deal legislation. The other thing he's worried about is Adolf Hitler in Europe. One of the creepy things of history, boys and girls, is that Franklin Roosevelt and Adolf Hitler come to power within about 6 weeks of each other, and they die within about 12 weeks of each other. So you have good and evil on the world stage at precisely the same time. Just as Hitler was beginning to solidify his power and begin the Second World War, Roosevelt's power was beginning to dissipate as he was in the 7th and 8th year of his presidential term. Roosevelt believed that if we were going to have trouble with Hitler, and he believed that we were likely to have trouble with Hitler, that we would need a strong president who knew how to get things done to stand up to Hitler. And so he thought, well, maybe I should run for a 3rd term just in case this Hitler guy starts getting out of hand. Don't forget, he had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War, so he saw the signs and symptoms of World War coming along. So people like Cordell Hull, Alvin Barkley, Joe Kennedy, these were some folks that were kind of floating around as potential Democratic nominees entering into the race in 1940. So let's change our poll here. Bling. But Roosevelt said, well, I don't think any of these guys are going to be able to do the job. So Roosevelt thought about running for a 4th term. He didn't make any announcements. He left everybody kind of, wondering what he was going to do. And this created a lot of anxiety with people. Now, I want to show you some political cartoons. Here is one where, they're showing how Roosevelt looks like he may become a dictator, okay? And keep in mind that this is very much in the minds of people because of people like Benito Mussolini in Italy, and Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, and Adolf Hitler in Germany. So it wasn't so far-fetched to think of these guys becoming powerful and then slipping from democratic principles into becoming dictators along the way. Let's see here. Here's another example of that. Okay, so you go from government reorganization, trying to pack the Supreme Court, to becoming a dictator. So there was a lot of opposition to Roosevelt running for a third term. And so what Roosevelt decided to do was he decided to sort of keep his powder dry and his mouth shut for as long as he possibly could. And then he wanted the nomination, but he wanted to be drafted for it. And what he wanted was the convention to overwhelmingly command that he get the nomination and begin to run for a third term. And once again, his old political work back in the counties and back at the boss levels, the democratic machines in the big cities, came in handy for this, because he was able to get these folks to work the convention and to begin to chant his name, Roosevelt, Roosevelt. And by doing this, he built this momentum in the convention that he should be the nominee and that he should be, selected to run for the third time, essentially being drafted. So he was sort of able to sort of play coy and say, ha ha ha, well, but if that's what you want, if you really think I should do it, okay, I'm not going to walk away from, my sense of duty and such. Eleanor Roosevelt goes to the convention. Again, it's in Chicago, and she gives a speech talking about how ordinarily you wouldn't want somebody to run for a third term. The way things were working with the 2 terms was really the way it ought to be. And she lays out this big case as to why that should be. But then she turns it on their heads, and she says, but that would be in ordinary times, and these are no ordinary times. And she goes on to then describe why Roosevelt is precisely the guy you need to run for that third term in 1940. And that's exactly what he decides to do, and that is exactly what happens. Now again, 1940, it's FDR versus Wendell Willkie, and so the big issues are no third term, well, we just covered that, and then also, are we going to get into war? Now, Wendell Willkie was kind of an odd pick for the Republicans that year. Wendell Willkie, as recently as 1938, had actually been a Democrat. And the Republicans didn't really have anybody to run against Roosevelt, or anybody that they thought could do the job. So they ended up picking Wendell Willkie, who, as I say, up until 38 had been a Democrat, and had been not only a Democrat, but a New Deal Democrat. And Willkie was also very much an internationalist, which is what Roosevelt was, believing that we had to get out there in the world and exert our influence. Otherwise, we would be the victims of things going on in the world happening to us. So in many ways, what it came down to was a choice between Roosevelt, who was quite liberal and internationalist, and Wendell Willkie, who was pretty liberal and pretty internationalist. And there was a senator from Indiana who said, if let's say a prostitute were to give up the profession and want to be taken to church, I would walk her down the aisle and set her in the pew myself. But I'd be damned if I would let her lead the choir on opening night. And that's the way a lot of people felt about Willkie. This guy was a recent Republican. This guy was basically a watered down version of Franklin Roosevelt. And what are we doing, picking this guy? And this is what some of the Democrats were saying, though, no third term. The Democrats were for Willkie as well, because Willkie, again, was not so much different from President Roosevelt. So we've got that going on there as well. Well, the election takes place, and of course, what ends up happening is on the 6th ballot, Wendell Willkie wins the nomination, and the election takes place, and Franklin Roosevelt wins once again. Now, shortly after the election, just 2 months after the election, Wendell Willkie basically endorses the things that Roosevelt is saying should be done as the crisis in Europe begins to develop and begins to overheat. So just the week before the election, Roosevelt had instituted the first peacetime draft so that we could begin to build an army against the Nazi army that was numbering in the millions in Europe. And Willkie had supported that as well. And then within 2 months after the election is over, Willkie begins to basically endorse many of the programs that Roosevelt was talking about in terms of the war. And Roosevelt sends Willkie to England on a goodwill tour to talk with the British about American policy toward helping them in the war. So it's really quite an interesting and unique election in 1940, and it broke that tradition of the 2-term limit that had been set by President Washington himself. Well, the war begins. We get dragged into the war on December 7th, 1941, and the first 2 years don't go so well for us, but by 1943 we begin to turn the tide, and along comes the 1944 election. Now, we are not out of the woods yet. Nobody knows the war is going to end in 1945, but we have turned the tide, and we are beginning to make progress. And so the question now becomes, in 1940, how do we handle this election? Roosevelt says, look, we're in the middle of this war. It's not a good time to change horses in the middle of a stream. Let me finish this out. This is my call of duty. Let me finish this out, and I'll see us through the war. And people felt comfortable with that to the point that they elected him to a 4th term against against the Republican nominee for president, Thomas Dewey. Now, Dewey was also an internationalist. Dewey also believed in the idea of a UN, and that's what Roosevelt believed in as well. So the 2 big issues in the 1940 election were, number one, finishing out the war, right? And of course, Roosevelt had done a fine job up to that point. Why change horses now? And number 2, crafting this idea of a post-war peace. And Roosevelt had an idea about that quite early on. Here's a sketch from 1943. Roosevelt sketching out what he thinks the United Nations should look like. And this is November 1943. And he says there should be 40 United Nations. There should be an executive committee and the 4 policemen, the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and China, who would then help to enforce the peace. Below the United Nations, what the United Nations should do is create an international labor organization, ILO, a health organization, and an agriculture and food committee. So basically what Roosevelt is laying out here is a sketchwork and a framework for delivering on his 4 freedoms: freedom from want, freedom from fear, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. And this is what he's thinking of in terms of a sketch for the United Nations. Thomas Dewey, in large measure, agrees with that as well. So there's not that much difference in terms of what they are viewing in terms of post-war period. The other big issue in the 1940 election was Roosevelt up to the task? You didn't have to be a doctor to see Roosevelt's health was failing. He was becoming weaker. He was becoming more frail, more forgetful. He comes back from the Yalta Conference in 1944, and he addresses Congress from the seated position. And he apologizes for that. You have to forgive me. I've just come back from 44,000 miles on this trip to try to, talk about how we're going to shape the post-war period. And quite frankly, it's easier to do sitting down than it is with 10 or 12 pounds of steel around my legs. So he's beginning to even show publicly that he's not as strong and vigorous as he once was. Thomas Dewey was only 48 years old and was in the prime of his life and was trying to draw this comparison between the older 63-year-old Franklin Roosevelt and the younger himself, Dewey, in terms of contrasting for the presidency and what you had to be up to end the war and get the post-war period off on a good footing. And so he tries to make an effort of an issue of Roosevelt's health. Well, Roosevelt won't have it, and he gives a speech at the Teamsters Union called the Fowler speech. And in this speech, he talks about how there had been this Republican rumor that Fowler had been left on one of the Aleutian Islands, and that a destroyer at the cost of millions of taxpayer dollars had been sent back to get Fowler. And it was all a fake, rumor, fake news, so to speak. And Roosevelt, turned it to humor, and he said, I don't regret or resent remarks about me. My family doesn't resent remarks about them. It comes with the program. It's part of the job of being a public figure and a politician. However, my little dog Fowler does resent the attacks. And the room burst into laughter. And it showed the old Roosevelt flair, the old Roosevelt wit, the old Roosevelt ability to command the attention and to build that excitement in a room that many people thought he had lost. Also that year, he in the campaign, he gave a 53-mile campaign tour through all the boroughs of New York. Now, he did this in October, and it was a miserable, rainy day, and he did it in an open car. But true to form, in typical Roosevelt fashion, he was thinking ahead. And so as he was going from borough to borough to borough, they had put aside little way stations for him where they could pull over, they could get him into a clean, dry set of clothes, maybe give him a little shot of brandy to warm him up and pep him up a bit, get him back on the road. So the crowds, as he was going through this 53-mile campaign stops throughout the boroughs of New York, were constantly seeing a refreshed and renewed Roosevelt everywhere he went, due to this these little pit stops that he was taking along the way. And what this did, of course, was it showed that he was up to the job. Now, the real issue then becomes who's going to be vice president. And by this point, Roosevelt in 1940 had insisted that Henry Wallace be on the ticket with him, and he would not be run for president unless Wallace could run as vice president along with him. And people wanted Roosevelt so much that they brought Wallace along with him. But by that point, Wallace was seen as too liberal. And people were beginning to get kind of tired of the Roosevelt, New Deal liberalism, and they were starting to cozy up to the Republicans and their more conservative views a little bit more. And Wallace was simply out of touch with this. So he wanted to dump Wallace for someone else. And the real issue then became, who was it going to be? And he ended up settling on Harry Truman. And Harry Truman was really the perfect choice to be vice president. He was almost directly from the geographic middle of the country, coming from Missouri. He could kind of claim he was from the north. He could kind of claim he was from the south. He wasn't really from the east, but he certainly wasn't from the west. He was right smack dab in the geographic middle of the country. And in fact, he was in many ways right smack dab in the political center of the country as well. He was a New Dealer, but he wasn't a rampant New Dealer, and he believed in fiscal responsibility and this idea of being a responsible government, responsible for the care of its citizens, but also responsible for itself in terms of how it operated. He'd also gained a great deal of notoriety in a thing called the Truman Committee, which was a committee that was put together to root out waste in the war and defense industries throughout the war. And he had saved billions of dollars by exposing fraud and waste in the defense industries. And so he had a good name for himself going with that. He was from the geographic and political center of the country, and he was selected to be Roosevelt's running mate. And he became vice president and served as vice president for just 82 days before becoming President of the United States. So one of the issues that really kind of came out of that election was, was Roosevelt smart in running for the fourth term? Was he responsible in that, knowing that his health was failing? And, but he also felt the sense of duty and this sense of having to finish out the job. Nobody knew the ins and outs and the particulars of the war the way Roosevelt did. And so that was partly what was driving him to run for the fourth term. So Franklin Roosevelt, the most elected president in the history of our republic, elected in 32 to straighten out the economy, elected in 36 in large measures because he had helped to straighten out the economy and was promising to do more. Elected in 1940, in part to protect his own legacy and in part to balance what was going on there in Europe, breaking the tradition of not running for a third term, thereby implementing the idea of the necessity for a 22nd Amendment, which limits it now to 2 full terms for the presidency. And 1944, staying on to finish the job, staying on to see America not just through the war, but to help set up the post-war peace, right? What would be coming after the war? How was the world going to be shaped and crafted in that way? And quite frankly, the president died in the service of his country, right? The presidency wore him out. It physically and emotionally just, wore him out to the point where he died of a cerebral hemorrhage on April 12th, 1945 in Warm Springs, Georgia. So in a few months, we're all going to go to the polls and vote, or at least we should, right? The idea of voting, and I'm not saying who to vote for, but the idea of voting is so fundamentally important. Our elections are so fundamentally important to our republic. And think that many people in this country, many people in the world have died for the right to vote. It is a wonderful opportunity for us directly to make decisions and impact what's going to be going on in our country for the next 4 years. And so just as Roosevelt, called everyone to the polls and, got American support behind his programs for those 4 terms, the Democrats are trying to do that. The Republicans are trying to do that. It all comes down to us on Election Day. So these have been Roosevelt's 4 elections. We hope that you've enjoyed this, and we'd like to see you again in another couple of weeks or maybe next week, learning more about the Roosevelt legacy and the kinds of things that happened during his time in office and during Mrs. Roosevelt's time in office as well. Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you again.